Near, 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 near. Who's knocking on my door? Near, near, near.
Has seen or heard from Susan Cox Powell.
The West Valley City mom of two disappeared December 6, 2000.
Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after as much as that's possible.
Near, 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 near.
On December 7, 2009, Susan Powell, a 28-year-old mother of two, seemingly vanished from her home in West Valley City, Utah. What started as a quiet Sunday evening quickly turned into a mystery that would capture the nation's attention and leave a devastating impact on those who loved her. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the dark and tragic story of Susan Powell's disappearance. Susan Powell, who was married to her husband, Joshua Powell, and together they had two young sons, Charlie and Braden. To the outside world, their family seemed like the typical suburban household. But behind closed doors, there were signs of tension, secrets, and troubling behavior that would soon come to light. On the night of Susan's disappearance, the police would show up, and Joshua would give the police a complete fake story on the whereabouts of Susan. He would go on to say that he took their sons on a late-night trip to the Utah wilderness, leaving Susan alone at home. He claimed that when they returned, Susan was gone, with no explanation, no note, and no signs of a struggle. But as investigators would dig deeper, they would quickly realize the story didn't quite add up. They would also go on to realize the behavior of Joshua to be kind of off, as he was nervous and quite frantic the whole time they were talking to him about the whereabouts of Susan, even giving answers to questions that seemed quite odd. In fact, it wasn't just his behavior that was suspicious, it was also his history. The police would go on to uncover very troubling details about Joshua's past, including reports of domestic abuse, most cases even being reported by Susan's family. This caused Susan to ultimately confide in those close to her, including her friends, about her fears for her safety and concerns over her marriage. This is where we get one of the most chilling pieces of evidence of what may have happened to Susan the day she disappeared. It would come in form of emails that Susan had sent to her friend, describing how she couldn't take it anymore and how she was trying to plan a divorce from her husband Joshua. In these emails, you can tell Susan and Joshua have been having problems for some time now, and even at some points, Susan threatens to call the police on him, also asking him to seek counseling to get better. But ultimately, Susan would want a divorce from Joshua, as she stated in her last email that her friend would ever receive from her. These emails would ultimately go on to give investigators more fuel to Joshua being involved in the disappearance of Susan. But despite the evidence in these emails and past history of domestic abuse, Joshua would continue to deny any involvement in his wife's disappearance. But the investigation into Susan's case soon revealed another troubling fact about Joshua that would make them even more suspect of Joshua's involvement in the disappearance. Investigators would come to reveal in the days after Susan vanished that Joshua packed up his two sons and moved to Washington State. This action was what really intensified suspicions. Even though investigators believed they had enough evidence to go after Joshua, they would ultimately hit a wall in the investigation, and unfortunately couldn't prove Joshua had any involvement in Susan's disappearance. It wouldn't be until almost 3 years later in 2012, investigators were able to work up a warrant to search Joshua's home, and what they found was a very disturbing discovery. A shocking archive of photos and videos documenting Joshua's abusive behavior towards Susan would be found in the home upon them searching. This would help investigators learn about Joshua's psychological manipulation, which made the pieces of the puzzle start to fall into place. After watching all the archive footage and viewing the photos Susan had documented and left behind.
This is me. July 29th, 2008. It is 12:33 Mountain Time. Covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after as much as that's possible. This is all stuff bought in a year or less through Home Depot on my credit. Josh bought a lot of stuff and then he had to bankrupt it. And then he bought a little bit more on my credit. There's a nice lamp.
Sadly, all this newfound evidence wouldn't help them find Susan. And even more tragically, Joshua Powell would go on to set his house on fire, locking himself and his 2 sons in the house with him, ultimately taking his life and his 2 sons' life as well. He would go on to leave behind a disturbing voicemail to his sister just minutes before it all had happened.
I am not able without my sons. I'm sorry to everyone I've hurt. Goodbye.
Sadly, we still have no idea what truly had happened to Susan the day she disappeared, and we still have no idea of her whereabouts. Most speculate Joshua murdered Susan, while others speculate it was Joshua's father, Stephen Powell. Stephen Powell would become the prime suspect due to his involvement with his son Joshua and Susan's relationship.
That's Susan. There's Josh.
Joshua and Susan would live with Stephen Powell early into their marriage, and Stephen would be around them a lot, even documenting times he would spend with them on his video camera.
Yes, we don't butcher the Spanish language.
You don't. This is the newest member of Susan and Josh's family.
What would go on to seem like basic video recordings turned into something more disturbing. As you can tell in most of the footage Stephen Powell would capture, it would mainly be of Susan. To make matters worse, Stephen would openly talk about his romantic desires for Susan on news networks during the time of her disappearance. But it wouldn't be until the year 2012 investigators would find footage of Stephen explaining his sexual desires for Susan.
I just had what was probably the most erotic experience I've had in my entire life. Here's my stash of pictures that I feel very fortunate to have. Here she is, and this is another high school shot.
This would ultimately make him the lead suspect after the passing of his son Joshua. But unfortunately, there hasn't been enough evidence to prove him guilty either. So ultimately, the disturbing disappearance of Susan Powell remains unsolved to this day. Timothy Pitson, the son of Jim Pitson and Amy Pitson, would be declared as missing on May 11, 2011, as reports would indicate he was last seen with his mother at a nearby water park in Wisconsin.
Illinois, there's new details being released today about the disappearance of Timothy Pitson, a 6-year-old boy from earlier this year. Police say that they have found what they call a considerable amount of blood.
Amy Pitson, born in 1974, had struggled with mental health issues for much of her adult life. She had a history of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability, which had been ongoing even before her marriage to Jim Pitson. Amy's depression, along with periods of emotional volatility, seemed to impact her relationships, including her marriage to Jim, and would later play a significant role in the tragic events that unfolded in May 2011. For a time, their family seemed like your typical happy family, but behind closed doors, Amy's mental health struggles were taking a toll on her personal life and her marriage. And over the years, Amy had gone through periods of severe depression, during which she would become withdrawn, anxious, and at times unable to fully function in her day-to-day life. Jim, her husband, would remain committed to their family, but their relationship became increasingly strained. There would be signs that their marriage was in trouble as Amy's emotional state worsened. The couple would go to counseling sessions, and Amy had been in therapy for her mental health issues. But despite this, the pressure on their marriage continued to build. On May 11th, 2011, Amy would take Timothy out of school early, claiming they were going on a fun trip for the day. She would tell the school that they were going to visit a water park. However, this would not be the case. Amy and Timothy would drive to the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, but that wouldn't be their final destination. Surveillance footage later showed Amy and Timothy stopping at a few different places, including a motel, but their whereabouts were unclear after that. It would be quickly determined by investigators that over the course of the day, Amy's actions seemed increasingly erratic. She checked into a motel in Rockford, Illinois, but the next morning, they would find her dead in a nearby hotel room. Authorities would also later determine that Amy had taken her own life that very day. This left investigators now searching for the whereabouts of Timothy. But unfortunately, despite an extensive search and numerous leads, Timothy was nowhere to be found. Amy's final words and actions left many questions unanswered. Like, why did she take Timothy out of school that day? And why did she take her own life? The authorities would end up finding some clues that Amy had left behind. It would be in a series of notes, including one mentioning that Timothy was safe but would never be found. It was a chilling message that only added to the mystery. But despite tons of leads, like the message Amy had left behind, the case would remain unsolved. Timothy's disappearance would become one of the most haunting and perplexing mysteries in recent memory, as we have no idea if he was hidden away by his mother or if something more sinister was at play. Unfortunately, the passing of Amy would be the ultimate cause for this case going unsolved, as she was the last person seen with her son, so speculations are more than likely Amy may have took her son's life as well, but there was hope because of the message she had left behind, and there would be more hope because about 9 years later, after the disappearance of Timothy, there would be a person who claimed to be the lost boy Timothy. A 14-year-old boy by the name of Brian Michael Reaney would report to the police, saying he was the missing child Timothy Pitson. He would also go on to state that he was kidnapped and sexually assaulted during the time he was missing. The boy would later be checked into a hospital, and that's when doctors tried to collect a DNA sample to make sure that he was indeed Timothy Pitson. The 14-year-old boy would try his best to prevent them from collecting a DNA sample, but he could only hold out for so long before admitting he was not the lost boy Timothy. This would leave investigators at a dead end after this hoax, as there hasn't been many leads or evidence pointing to where Timothy Pitson could be, just only the eerie note she had left behind. Alina Cohen was a singer and a songwriter who started her YouTube channel back in 2006. She would go on to gain a good amount of traction for her stunning voice, amassing around 10,000 subscribers by 2011. Thanks to her impressive covers and original songs, she was even positioning herself for a potential breakthrough in the music industry. Even though Alina was beginning to find success on YouTube and her singing career, she would begin reducing her online presence dramatically after 2011, eventually disappearing altogether in 2014. It would seem this decision was interconnected with being stalked and being harassed. Incidents would link to a fan named E Thunder, which raised alarms and concerns among her loyal fanbase. eThunder was an over-obsessive fan who posted tons of claims and conspiracies about Alina online, causing Alina a lot of distress and uncomfort. His erratic behavior included alleging they had a personal connection, and he played a key into her success, which correlated with her decision to step away from social media, raising suspicions of harassment. After about a year absence, Alina would return in 2012 to release a new song, but she would quickly disappear off the internet again shortly after that. This brief stint of Alina would raise quite a concern and questions about whether the increased harassment from eThunder during her short-lived return contributed to her decision to vanish again. This stalker would go on to make several dubious claims, including that he knew where Alina lived and that he was responsible for her rise in popularity due to his promotions. His obsessive and erratic behavior suggested a delusional belief that he had a major influence on her career. He would also go on to mention how he was arrested in 2012, allegedly because of his interactions online with Alina. His claims included being charged with carrying a weapon, hinting at potential stalking motives, and further suggesting that his behavior posed a real threat to her safety. Alina's repeated disappearances and her sudden announcement of a trip to Africa after eThunder reportedly faced legal consequences suggest she was attempting to distance herself from her stalker, highlighting a real fear for her personal safety. Though her whereabouts remain largely unknown to this very day, hints from the past year suggest that Alina has sporadically released music again. This raises hope amongst fans that she is still alive and may be considering re-engagement with her audience, possibly feeling safer now. To put things into perspective, Alina disappeared from the internet to get away from a serious stalker. Apparently, though, this case hasn't been fully closed. Whether eThunder really had a major role on her success, or if he was just an obsessed stalker who was really trying to ruin this girl Alina's life, even getting so bad she disappeared from the internet altogether. But what do you guys think? I'd love to know in the comments, and while you're at it, consider leaving us a like and subscribing, as it really supports the channel.